Welcome to Chapter 5, Pillar 4, Third Party Risk Management. And honestly, this might be the most consequential chapter in the whole course, because this is where DORA breaks new ground. Remember our bakery that supplied the whole town? This chapter is all about managing those critical suppliers. In a world where banks run on cloud providers and software vendors, your resilience is only as strong as theirs. So here's what we'll explore together. We start by building the third-party risk framework and learning to tier providers by criticality. Then, we cover the homework you do before signing, due diligence, concentration risk, and mapping the supply chain beneath your suppliers. Next, the contracts. We'll dig into DORA's mandatory contractual provisions, the famous Article 30 covering service levels, audit rights, data location, and termination. This is where compliance gets very concrete. Then we move to the ongoing relationship, continuous monitoring, and vitally, exit planning. What happens if you need to leave a provider? Finally, we'll examine the oversight of critical third-party providers and what designation means for vendors. By the end, you'll see your suppliers in a whole new light. Let's begin. Let's start building the foundation of third-party risk management, the framework itself. Because here's a truth I want you to internalize early. Managing suppliers can't be ad hoc. You can't just react to problems as they pop up. You need a structured framework that covers the entire relationship from start to finish. Let me show you what that looks like. Think about the full life cycle of a supplier relationship. It begins with selection, choosing the right provider, then contracting, getting the agreement right, then ongoing monitoring, keeping an eye on them over time, and eventually, possibly, exit, ending the relationship cleanly. A good framework has policies for every one of these stages. Nothing's left to chance. And crucially, this framework must align with DORA's requirements and with your overall ICT risk strategy. It's not a separate island, it connects to everything else we've built. You also assign clear roles across your business and control functions so everyone knows their part. Let me give you an analogy. Think of how a good company manages employees. There's recruitment, onboarding, ongoing management, and eventually offboarding, all governed by clear HR policies. Third-party management is remarkably similar. You're managing relationships through a defined life cycle. So my advice, resist the temptation to treat each supplier as a one-off. Build the framework once, apply it consistently, and document everything for supervisory review. A solid framework turns supplier chaos into supplier control. That's the goal, and everything else in this chapter builds on it. Now let's get practical about a smart way to manage many suppliers without losing your mind. Tiering. Here's the reality. You probably have dozens, maybe hundreds of ICT providers. You cannot possibly apply the same intense scrutiny to all of them. That would be exhausting and frankly silly. So you tier them by risk. Let me explain how. The core idea is simple. You group your providers into tiers based on how critical they are to your important business functions. Your most critical providers, the ones whose failure would seriously hurt you, go in the top tier and get the deepest controls and closest attention. The minor ones, like the supplier of some non-essential tool, sit in lower tiers with lighter oversight. When tiering, you also consider things like substitutability. How easily could you replace this provider? And concentration. Are you dangerously dependent on them? A provider that's both critical and hard to replace deserves your most serious focus. Let me use a relatable picture. Think of how you manage relationships in your own life. Your closest family, you invest heavily in. Acquaintances, you check in occasionally. You naturally tier your attention based on importance. Supplier management works the same way. Focus your energy where it matters most. So my advice, use these tiers to direct your due diligence and monitoring effort intelligently. And review the tiering regularly because a provider's importance can change as your services and dependencies evolve. Today's minor vendor could become tomorrow's critical dependency. Tiering keeps your attention where the real risk lives. Let's talk about teamwork. because managing third-party risk well is genuinely a team sport. No single department can do it alone, and when functions work in silos, things fall through the cracks. DORA-grade third-party management needs several functions working together, each bringing their piece. Let me introduce the players and their roles. First, procurement. They manage the sourcing and the contract execution, finding providers and getting deals done. Then, IT, who assess the technical security and resilience of a provider. Can this vendor actually keep our systems safe and running? Next, risk, who evaluate the broader exposure and concentration. What's our overall danger here? Then, legal, absolutely vital under DORA because they ensure the contracts actually meet the regulations requirements, including those mandatory clauses we'll cover. And finally, compliance, who oversee adherence to the rules and maintain that all-important register. Here's the challenge I've seen play out repeatedly. Each function assumes another is handling something. Procurement thinks legal check the DORA clauses. Legal thinks IT assess the security. And a critical gap opens up. It's like an orchestra where everyone assumes someone else is keeping time and the music falls apart. So my advice, define clearly who owns what and make sure these functions actually communicate. The best third-party programs have these teams collaborating around a shared process, not working in isolation. When procurement, IT, risk, legal and compliance play in harmony, your third-party risk management becomes genuinely robust. Let's talk about a specific, mandatory DORA requirement that's deceptively important, the ICT third-party register. This isn't optional, and it's not just bureaucratic box ticking. It's a foundational tool, and regulators take it seriously. So let's understand what it is and why it matters so much. At its core, the register is a comprehensive record of all your ICT third-party arrangements. Every provider, every key contract captured in one place. And DORA, through the implementing standards, specifies exactly what data fields you must include and what format to use. So it's not a casual spreadsheet you design however you like. There's a prescribed structure. Crucially, you must identify which arrangements support critical or important functions. This flagging is what makes the register powerful. It lets you and regulators instantly see where the high-stakes dependencies lie. Why does this matter so much? Here's a real insight. Regulators use these registers across the whole sector to spot concentration risk, to see if hundreds of firms all depend on the same few providers. Your register feeds that bigger picture. And for you internally, it's your single source of truth about who you depend on. Here's my honest advice from the field. The biggest challenge isn't creating the register, it's keeping it accurate. Providers change, contracts get added, services shift. An outdated register is worse than useless. It's misleading. So assign clear ownership, update it diligently, and be ready to submit it to authorities when required. Treat it as a living asset, not a dusty archive. Let's talk about a moment full of opportunity and risk. The time before you sign with a provider. Because here's a hard truth. Your leverage is never higher than before you've signed. Once the ink is dry, your options shrink. So pre-contractual due diligence is where you do your homework and protect yourself. Let me walk you through what to check. What should you evaluate? Start with the provider's security and resilience posture. Can they actually keep your data and services safe? Then, their business continuity and disaster recovery capability. If disaster strikes them, can they keep serving you? Don't just take their marketing word for it, dig into the evidence. Look at their financial stability and track record too. A provider in financial trouble is a resilience risk. They might cut corners or even collapse. And check their sub-outsourcing and data location practices. Where does your data actually go and who else touches it? Let me give you a real-life parallel. Think about buying a house. You don't just love the kitchen and sign. You get a survey, check for damp, verify the title, inspect the foundations. Due diligence on a provider is exactly that, looking beneath the shiny surface before you commit. So my advice, be thorough and be skeptical in the best way. Document your findings carefully, including any risks you decide to accept and why. That documentation matters hugely, both for DORA and for your own protection. Remember, the questions you ask before signing are far cheaper than the regrets you'll have after. Let's revisit a theme that runs all through DORA: concentration risk, but now from the third party angle specifically. This is one of those risks that hides in plain sight, feeling perfectly fine right up until the moment it isn't. So let's shine a light on it and understand how to manage your provider dependencies wisely. Here's the essence. Concentration risk is the danger of relying too heavily on a single provider or a single technology. When too many of your eggs sit in one basket, that basket becomes a massive single point of failure. And it works at two levels. There's your own firm's concentration, and there's the sector-wide concentration where everyone depends on the same few giants. Remember our town and its single bakery? If that one bakery fails, the whole town goes hungry. That's concentration risk made vivid. Now imagine you've built your entire operation on one cloud provider. They have a major outage, and suddenly everything you do grinds to a halt. No fallback, no alternative. So what do? You assess this dependency honestly. You consider the impact if a key provider fails, or importantly, exits the relationship. You factor concentration into your contracting and your exit planning. And you monitor it continuously because dependencies deepen over time, often without anyone noticing. Here's my candid advice. Don't let convenience blind you. It's tempting to consolidate everything with one excellent provider. It's easier, often cheaper. But ask yourself the uncomfortable question: what's my plan if they disappear tomorrow? If you don't have a good answer, that's concentration risk staring back at you. Let's uncover something that catches many firms off guard: sub-outsourcing and what we call fourth-party risk. Here's the eye-opener. Your provider has providers too. And those hidden layers can carry real risk that you never see coming, unless you go looking. So let's learn to map the full delivery chain. Here's the scenario. You contract with a provider for a critical service. Feels clean and simple, right? But that provider might subcontract part of the work to another company who might rely on yet another. Suddenly, your critical service depends on a chain of companies you've never even heard of. Those are your fourth parties and beyond. Think of it like ordering a meal at a restaurant. You trust the restaurant, but do you know where they source their ingredients? Who supplies their supplier? If there's contamination 3 steps back in that chain, it ends up on your plate, even though you only ever dealt with the restaurant. So DORA expects you to map subcontractors supporting your critical services to understand where your data actually flows across that chain. You set contractual conditions on sub-outsourcing, and you require transparency when those arrangements change. You assess the risks introduced by these lower-tier providers. My honest advice? This is hard work, and many firms stop at their direct provider. But the weakest link in your supply chain might be 3 layers down, completely invisible to you. So push for transparency, demand to know the chain, and don't let your critical dependencies hide in the shadows. What you can't see can absolutely hurt you. Now we arrive at one of the most concrete, hands-on parts of DORA, Article 30. If you remember one article number from this entire regulation, make it this one. Article 30 spells out the clauses that every ICT contract must contain. This is where compliance stops being theoretical and starts being something your legal team must physically put into agreements. Let me explain its weight. Here's the deal. Article 30 sets out mandatory contractual provisions, the non-negotiable terms your provider agreements must include. And there's a layered approach. Stronger, more extensive requirements apply for contracts supporting critical or important functions. So the more important the service, the more your contract must contain. What does it cover? A range of essentials: service levels, access and audit rights, security requirements, incident cooperation and reporting support, data location, sub-outsourcing conditions, and termination rights. We'll explore several of these in detail next. The point is, these aren't nice to haves, they're legal requirements. Now, here's the part that becomes a massive project in practice. Your existing contracts, the ones signed before DORA, almost certainly don't meet these requirements. So they must be remediated, renegotiated to add the missing clauses. I've seen firms discover hundreds of non-compliant contracts needing rework. It's a huge undertaking. So my advice? Get your legal team intimately familiar with Article 30 and start the contract remediation early, prioritizing your critical providers. Think of Article 30 as the DNA that must be present in every ICT contract. Without it, your compliance has a fundamental gap. Let's zoom into some of the most important clauses that Article 30 demands, because these are where the rubber really meets the road. Service levels, audit rights, and incident notification. These three turn a vague supplier relationship into one with real teeth and accountability. Let me explain why each matters so much. Start with service level agreements or SLAs. These define clear performance standards. How available must the service be? How fast must they respond? Without defined SLAs, good service is just a matter of opinion. With them, you have measurable commitments you can actually enforce. Then audit rights. This is crucial. You need the right to audit and inspect your provider, and importantly, so do regulators. Why does this matter? Imagine depending on a provider for a critical function, but having no right to check whether they are actually secure. You'd be flying blind. Audit rights give you and supervisors the ability to look under the hood. And incident notification clauses. Your provider must tell you promptly when something goes wrong on their end and cooperate during your incident response. Picture this. Your provider has a breach affecting your data, but you only find out weeks later from the news. Disastrous, right? These clauses prevent that nightmare. So my advice, treat these clauses as your safety net. Tie remedies to breaches of key obligations so there are real consequences. And make sure incident notification timelines from your provider actually support your own DORA reporting deadlines. A provider who notifies you too slowly can blow your regulatory timeline. Get these clauses right and you're genuinely protected. Let's continue through the essential contract clauses, covering three more that protect you in important ways: data location, sub-outsourcing conditions, and termination rights. These deal with where your data lives, who else might touch it, and how you get out if needed. Let me walk you through why each deserves careful attention. First, data location. Your contract should specify where your data may be stored and processed. Why does this matter? Because data location affects legal jurisdiction, regulatory compliance, and risk. You don't want to discover your sensitive data is sitting in a country with weak protections or somewhere that complicates your GDPR obligations. Pin it down explicitly. Second, sub-outsourcing conditions. Remember that delivery chain we mapped? Your contract should set conditions and require approvals for sub-outsourcing. This stops your provider from quietly shifting your critical service to some unknown fourth party without your knowledge or consent. You stay in control of the chain. Third, termination rights. You need clear rights and triggers to end the relationship, plus requirements for data return and deletion on exit. Imagine wanting to leave a provider but realizing you have no clean way out and they're holding your data hostage. A nightmare, and entirely avoidable with the right clauses. So my advice, think ahead when negotiating these. The best time to plan your exit is before you even enter. Make sure termination provisions protect your continuity through any transition. These clauses might feel pessimistic to negotiate upfront, but they're exactly what saves you when a relationship sours or a provider fails. Plan for the goodbye while saying hello. Let's shift from signing the contract to living with it. Because here's a mistake firms make all the time. They do brilliant due diligence, sign a great contract, and then relax. They assume the provider stays exactly as good as they were on day one. But things change, and that's why continuous monitoring matters so much. Let me explain. The reality is, a provider's performance and security posture can drift over time. The excellent vendor you onboarded might cut staff, get acquired, deprioritize security, or quietly start sub-outsourcing more. Continuous monitoring is how you catch that drift before it becomes a crisis. You watch their SLAs, their security, their resilience on an ongoing basis. What do you track? Their performance against those agreed service levels, any incidents they experience, changes in their setup or sub-outsourcing. You use KPIs and regular reviews to flag any provider that's deteriorating so you can act early. Think of it like a long-term relationship or a marriage. You don't just commit on the wedding day and stop paying attention. You keep checking in, keep communicating, notice when something's off. Relationships, including supplier ones, need ongoing care, not just an initial commitment. So my advice, build monitoring into your routine with clear escalation through your governance when issues arise. And document it all, because regulators want evidence you're actively watching your providers, not just trusting and forgetting. The firms that get blindsided are usually the ones who stopped paying attention after signing. Don't be one of them. Let's tackle something that feels uncomfortable but is absolutely vital: planning your exit. Nobody likes thinking about how a relationship might end while it's going well. But in third-party risk, having a solid exit strategy isn't pessimism, it's professionalism, and DORA explicitly requires it for critical arrangements. Let me explain why this is so important. Here's the core idea. For all your critical provider relationships, you need an exit plan. Why? Because you might have to leave. The provider could fail, become too risky, get too expensive, or simply stop meeting your needs. And if you have no plan, you're trapped, dangerously dependent, with no way out. That's a resilience nightmare. So a good exit strategy identifies alternatives or insourcing options in advance. Where would you go instead? It defines the steps to transition without disrupting your services. And here's the part firms skip. You actually test those transition procedures to confirm they'd really work. Let me give you a vivid analogy. Think of fire escape routes in a building. You don't wait for the fire to figure out how to get out. You plan the route in advance, and crucially, you run fire drills to make sure the route actually works and people know it. An untested exit plan is like a fire escape that might be locked. You only discover the problem when it's too late. So my advice, develop exit plans for your critical providers. Test the transitions and keep the plans current and documented. It's hard, often expensive work and easy to defer. But the day you genuinely need to leave a provider, a tested exit plan is worth its weight in gold. Now let's return to those critical third-party providers, the CTPPs, and understand exactly how a provider becomes designated as one. This is a significant moment because designation flips a switch. Suddenly, a tech company finds itself under direct European supervision. Let me walk you through how it happens and what it means. Here's the process. The European supervisory authorities, our friends the ESAs, are the ones who designate a provider as critical. They don't do it randomly, they use defined criteria. Key factors include the provider's systemic importance, how essential they are to the financial system, their substitutability, how easily they could be replaced, and the number of financial entities they serve. So picture a cloud giant serving hundreds of European banks with few real alternatives. That's a textbook CTPP candidate, too important and too irreplaceable to leave unsupervised. What's the outcome of designation? It brings the provider under direct EU oversight, and a lead overseer is assigned to watch them, as we discussed back in Chapter 1. The designation status is published, so it's public knowledge, and the provider is then actively monitored. Here's why this matters to you, even though you're the financial entity, not the provider. When your critical provider gets designated, it affects your relationship and your obligations too. You'll need to cooperate with that oversight. So my advice, keep track of which of your providers are or might become CTPPs. Their designation status ripples directly into your own compliance world. Awareness here keeps you ahead of the curve. Let's dig deeper into the lead overseer and, importantly, what their existence means for you as a financial entity. Because here's a point firms sometimes miss. The oversight of critical providers isn't something that happens over there with no impact on you. You have an active role to play. Let me explain the powers and your responsibilities. First, the powers. The lead overseer, one of the ESAs assigned to a critical provider, has real authority. They can request information, conduct inspections, and issue recommendations that the CTPP is expected to follow. It's genuine, hands-on supervision of the provider. Now here's your part. Financial entities must cooperate with this oversight. You can't just sit back. And there's a powerful lever in play. If a critical provider proves non-compliant and won't fix things, your use of that provider may be restricted. Imagine being told you might have to stop using a provider you depend on. That's a serious consequence, and it flows down to you. These cooperation obligations also flow through to your contracts, which connects right back to Article 30. Your agreements need to support this oversight regime. Let me frame it simply. Think of the lead overseer as a building inspector for a critical shared structure. The inspector deals with the building owner, but you, as a tenant relying on that structure, must cooperate and pay attention to the findings. If the inspector condemns part of it, that affects you directly. So my advice? Understand that CTPP oversight is a shared responsibility. Stay engaged, ensure your contracts enable cooperation, and watch the lead overseer's findings closely. Their work directly shapes your operational reality. Let's close this chapter by shifting perspective entirely. So far, we've mostly looked at things through the financial entity's eyes. But now, let's stand in the shoes of the vendor, the technology provider who gets designated as critical. Because designation is a genuinely double-edged sword for them, and understanding their view makes you a smarter partner. Let me explain. On one hand, designation brings real burdens. The vendor faces increased regulatory scrutiny, new compliance expectations, and oversight fees. They actually help fund their own supervision, remember? They must invest heavily in resilience and transparency, opening themselves up to inspections and information requests. That's a significant cost and effort, and frankly, a culture shift for a company that's never been regulated like a bank before. But on the other hand, there's an upside. Designation can be a market differentiator. A provider under credible EU oversight can say to financial clients, "We're held to the highest resilience standards, trusted enough to be supervised directly." That's a powerful trust signal in a competitive market. Let me put it in human terms. It's a bit like a restaurant earning a top hygiene rating. Yes, the inspections are demanding and ongoing, but that rating becomes a badge of trust that attracts customers. Designation shapes the vendor's commercial relationships, for better and worse. So my advice, understand this dynamic when you work with critical providers. They're navigating real pressures from designation. The best partnerships come from appreciating both sides. And that wraps our deep dive into third-party risk, arguably DORA's most groundbreaking territory.